not part of our forum as well. So uh, I also want that they should join us in our forum. You can, if you are interested in IR forum, then you can write to us at irforum.thinkindia@gmail.com. Now, for the further conduction of the session, I'd hand over the mic to Adrita. She'll be moderator for the day and she'll conduct the session. Adrita, it's over to you.
Yes, good
Adrita,
evening.
can you hear?
Dr. Datish, am I audible?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah.
perfectly
You can.
audible.
You are audible.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yeah, please start. You're audible.
Dr. Datish Parulekar sir is currently an assistant professor in School of International India Studies, Goa University, and visiting professor at various universities based in India and abroad. He is an academician for excellence when it comes to foreign relations. His erudite expertise and knowledge spans across foreign policy, Sino-Indian engagement, strategic maritime affairs, and Latin American political economy. Amongst others, he has been all over the globe, delving and think tanks, especially based in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. He has presented more than 75 national and international papers, seminars, lectures, apart from attributing more than 7 distinguished publications. One can also find him delivering proficient TED Talks across diverse platforms. It's really a pleasure for all of us to have such a dynamic personality in academic area of international relations as our resource person today. I would like to tell every participant that this session is scheduled for 45 minutes and extra 20 minutes is given for Q&A session. So I would request every participant to post their question in the live chat box, and that those questions will be addressed at the end of this session. And now I welcome Sir to take this platform and enlighten us on the topic of quadrilateral security dialogue construct for solidarity, stability, and sustainability in the Indo-Pacific. We welcome you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Once again, confirming that I am audible to everyone.
Yes.
Yeah. You're audible,
Okay,
sir.
great. So at the outset, thank you very much to International Relations Forum of Think India for inviting me to deliver my perspective on this theme. Now, we are meeting at a very important juncture. We're just 3 days away from the second ministerial edition of what is called as the Quad, which is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which will be taking place in Tokyo on the 6th of October. We are 3 weeks into a new Japanese Prime Minister, and we are trying to understand what exactly Japanese foreign policy means. We are also just less than a month away, in fact, exactly a month away from the US presidential elections, which is going to also throw in another kind of an uncertain curveball, depending on what is exactly going to happen come January of next year. Apart from that, we have this month itself a very important meeting happening in China, and that is the Central Working Committee of the Chinese Communist Party will be meeting this month, and day before them have a very important initiative to consider, explore, and take a decision on. It is being written in some circles. It is popularly known as what is called as the dual circulation plan. Now, I will come to all of that because all of these things have got tremendous reverberations and tremendous implications for how the world order is going to evolve in the foreseeable future. uh, if you look at the rise of China, the rise of China in intellectual and policy making discourse seems to have a particular hypothesis. And that hypothesis goes to the core of trying to understand China in its duality. the way in which China strategically behaves on the world stage, it comes across as a dichotomy. On the one hand, there is unbrimming opportunity of dealing with China. China brings you unbridled opportunity in terms of economic growth, in terms of prosperity, in terms of technological advancement, in terms of being able to engage with the Chinese market. There's no doubt about it. But on the other hand, you also have the predatory and perverse nature of Chinese actions that obviously makes China a stifling threat. And so this threat versus opportunity syndrome that accompanies China's rise is something that one has to constantly keep in the back of their mind. Because particularly since COVID has struck, we are seeing both elements of Chinese power play being played out on the international scene, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Every one of us is focused, almost obsessed on the aggressive, belligerent actions of China, as obviously we must. Because China has used the fact that it has been able to rebound from COVID-19 much faster than any other economy. And by all indications, it seems to be now on a V-shaped recovery, as others are looking more like a W-shaped recovery or maybe an L-shaped recovery. China seems to be exploiting the weaknesses that it finds in democratic systems. It seems to be one by one picking off fights and picking off opportunities in dealing with democratic states. Now, amidst the series of belligerent actions that began, of course, with skirmishes against Vietnam, that began with a very artificial re-administration of the jurisdiction of physical features in the South China Sea, that continued through heightened patrolling around what is called as the Senkaku Islands, which essentially are disputed islands between China and Japan. So getting into a collision with Japan, trying to once again transgress the exclusive economic zone of Malaysia. Of course, a standoff was able to keep them off that. Then moving to India and then taking on a fight in Ladakh with India. And the list goes on and on and on. But even as we look at these belligerent actions of China, for which we obviously have to build a countervailing strategy, we also have to keep in mind what China is doing in the post-pandemic era. It is trying to also show the world that it is best capable of being able to prove that it is a player on the world stage. By all accounts, it has announced that it has a vaccine that probably will be ready by the end of the year. They have already identified 3 countries who probably will get the vaccine that they will be producing, which is Sinovac Biotech Limited. They have already identified these 3 countries as being Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey. And stage 3 clinical trials are on in all these 3 countries. Now, if this were to come to fruition by the end of the year, and they seem to be very confident because right now the news in Beijing is that they already have begun to administer this to party officials and officials within the military. And they have not yet put it out. They plan to put it out by December. If they are able to stumble upon a vaccine, then they obviously will be showing you a different element to China that we all have not been accustomed to. So we see China only as a threat. Suddenly China becomes an opportunity because a large number of small countries around the world who cannot really afford costly medicines and costly vaccines that come from the West are obviously going to look at China with a certain degree of longing. And this, if this comes to fruition, is going to be dangerous because it's going to give China tremendous leverage to be able to almost, in a sense, coerce these smaller countries into making strategic concessions either on territory or on maritime zones in return for this particular vaccine. But you see, it's not only the belligerence of China which is creating a threat. It is also the opportunity that China creates through its own technological advancement that gives it further leverage in terms of how it is seen in the world. We also saw the announcement back in the month of May that China wants to come out with a digitalized version of its currency, the Renminbi. Now, this again is a new area of operation because China would be the first country in the world and certainly the first major power in the world to operate a digital or an electronic version of its currency. Now, this is important because I was just reading that already in the latest, blockchain patents that have been filed for 2019, 2020, China has filed almost 1/2 of the global patents for blockchain strategy and blockchain technology. As we are beginning to look at finance and tech as being 2 very important sectors, and the world seems to be moving into a very higher sophisticated way of quality of life, where things are getting more and more cashless, things are getting more and more electronic. If the financial sector starts to get controlled by electronic means, and if China is seen as a pioneer ahead of the United States, ahead of Western Europe, and certainly ahead of East Asia, then this is going to add another feather in their cap, and it's going to give them further depth in the financial system, which until now we felt they were probably kept out of. So this is the second point. The third point is, in order to influence the maritime economy of the Indo-Pacific, because all the time when we discuss about Indo-Pacific, the story is invariably seen through the prism of security. And any security complex or any security proposition by nature is always a zero-sum proposition. That means I win, you lose, you win, I lose. Security is rarely seen in terms of a win-win outcome, because it's very difficult to see how everybody can win in a highly securitized environment. So whenever you talk of security, it's always either about we containing China or China looking to push back against the world. But apart from that, China is also looking to, kind of insert another element in this proposition, and that is to try and transform the maritime economy of the Indo-Pacific. And they're looking to use their very strategic island of Hainan, which is of course off Hong Kong, off Vietnam, and to be able to develop this particular island as a free trade economic and port zone. Now, this would be interesting because they already have 18 economic zones on land. In fact, they were pioneers of these, exclusive economic zones. But if this were to be brought to fruition in the next 15 years, over 3 phases of 5 years each, it obviously is going to mean that they are going to be in a position now to almost influence, if not dictate, the maritime economy situation in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Because obviously the emergence of Hainan as a free port economic and trade zone where you can actually even fly in without a visa, it's almost going to serve like Singapore city serves, or like, for example, Hong Kong was serving for a long time, where you did not need a visa to travel to Hong Kong because Hong Kong was separate from the mainland. So the trying to position Hainan in this respect is also going to be another big opportunity for them. Now, the title of this particular brief says the Quad construct, and we're basically looking at 3 considerations: solidarity, stability, and sustainability in the Indo-Pacific. And why does this come about? Now, let me give you 4 or 5 important milestones that have contributed in many senses to the coming of age of what we call as the Indo-Pacific construct. The first is 1993. What happened that year? This was a pivot year for China and Chinese consumption, because until that year, China's manufacturing or China's extraction of oil was sufficient for domestic consumption. That year, China's domestic consumption exceeded domestic supply, and that made China a net oil importer, and it forced China to go beyond its shores and to obviously look for energy supplies. And we all know where the energy supplies came in 1993. They still continue to largely come from the Middle East and West Asia, but they also now come from various parts of Africa, particularly West Africa, but also certain parts of East Africa. So as a result of this, the Indian Ocean for the first time now comes into the strategic calculus of China, because if China has to source this oil, it obviously has to look at various factors concerning the transit of oil across the Indian Ocean, through the Malacca Straits, through the East and South China Sea, all the way to the Chinese East Coast. The second milestone is in 2001. This is when China joins the WTO. Now, China was already emerging as an economy with a very high GDP, but you have to translate that GDP into actual commercial heft on the global scene. For example, you see India's GDP. India's GDP has also grown. In purchasing power terms, we are the 3rd strongest or largest economy in the world. Leave aside what's happened with the pandemic, but I'm talking pre-pandemic, because pandemic is a kind of a black swan event. But even though we were the 3rd largest economy in purchasing power parity, what is our share in global merchandise export? It is a minuscule percentage. It is not even 1.5%. And that is why when it comes to global trade, no one ever involves India in global trade negotiations, because 60% of India's economy and GDP is driven by domestic consumption. So we are a country that has not been able to make a kind of a splash or an impact on global trade, despite of growing our economy manifold over the last 25, 30 years. But China has managed to do that because it was an export-oriented economy all along. So in 2001, when they joined the WTO and became an official member of the WTO, you saw a exponential rise in Chinese export and import volumes, which has made China today not only the biggest producer in the world or the kind of factory floor shop for the world, but also it has become a significant player in terms of export and import of countries. Even as we speak today, there are more than 100 countries in the world whose largest trading partner is China. Now that logically tells you, if your largest trading partner is a particular country, do you really have strategic room for maneuver in trying to kind of mutate your policy with that country? You obviously don't, because you are essentially in the hands of that country, and that country has a stranglehold over you. So the point is, this has given China tremendous heft. And obviously, when you talk about export import, where will China export or import from? It will obviously export or import, apart from the US, it will do so largely from places in Africa, Latin America, and Europe. All of them, again, if you have to transport, needs the access to the Indian Ocean. So that made the Indian Ocean again important. And you had the rise of some kind of an Indo-Pacific concept happening, at least in calculus. The third was what the Chinese were kind of gradually doing through the early 2000s, which had implications for India. They realized that to be able to have any kind of power projection in the Indian Ocean, you needed certain staging or basing stations. And that for them obviously was going to be bases, because because China was not the kind of country with whom any other country is going to sign agreements of alliances, military alliances. So China knew that military alliances won't happen. So what they needed to do was use their economic and financial power to be able to lure these islands away from some of the smaller nations, to offer them the incentive of port building facilities, so they actually will be able to have staging and basing grounds all within the Indian Ocean, whether it's the eastern side of the Indian Ocean, or the southern or the western part of the Indian Ocean. It's 2007-8, which has really, in a sense, changed the dynamic. Because since the global economic and financial crisis, you have seen the rise of Chinese power in more exponential terms. If you just take a look at what has happened since 2009-10 and say 2019, before the pandemic, that period of 10 years, and if you look at the major GDP growths in aggregate terms of most countries in the world, you find that even though China's growth rate came down from double digits to about 6.5%, in what is called as the new normal in China, it has not really affected them in terms of GDP. And that is because they did two or three things. First point was, they went immediately when they saw their economic growth rate declining, they went into what is called as a rebalancing of their economy, where they moved away from simply being the export floor shop for the world to actually now becoming a country driven by domestic consumption. And much of that domestic consumption was to come from production at home, but that domestic consumption also meant they now were going to engage with new age economies, high value economies, because now what Chinese were demanding, the kind of products, were the higher value products, were the semi-automated and automated components. So as a result of this, China once again began to change its strategy and again looked more at the maritime orientation of its entire foreign and economic policy. But the real change has happened since 2012-13, when China came out openly and announced what is now popularly known as the Belt and Road Initiative, formerly called the One Belt, One Road. Now, what is interesting here is China never really came out with a map. In fact, even today, the Chinese have not officially ever put out a map saying, this is our strategy of the Belt and Road Initiative. These are the precise points on which we'll be building infrastructure. And this is how far or how near the Belt and Road Initiative is. What they did very smartly was they simply, through two statements, put out a kind of an alignment, calling it a Silk Road economic belt over land and a maritime Silk Route through the water, and they left it at that. The moment they said that, you had the world waking up and drawing new maps and trying to show them how this whole situation develops. And what you see as the two alignments today were largely what the world drew rather than what China drew. China always likes to behave in a certain degree of opacity and secrecy. And so they have never really put out any clear-cut roster of projects. Because if they put out these projects, then if they succeed or fail, you are in a position to be able to assess this. But if they never tell you what is part of Belt and Road, you are never going to be in a position to be able to understand as to what exactly is Belt and Road. So we keep talking about a certain project having collapsed as being part of Belt and Road, but the Chinese have never put out a Belt and Road strategy in terms of actual projects. Now, why do you think that the Indo-Pacific strategy has become so important for countries? There was a time in the 90s and the early 2000s when the Americans largely looked at this region from the prism of the Cold War. And they continue to look at what we call as the Indo-Pacific today as the Asia Pacific, okay, as the Asia Pacific. And over time, what happened was the Asia Pacific became the linchpin to American security system, and it became the linchpin to American trade and investment system. In 2007, the first move was made towards trying to deconstruct this whole notion that there is a separate Pacific Ocean and there is a separate Indian Ocean. And this happened with Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. When Prime Minister Abe Shinzo came to India in 2007, he was speaking in the Indian Parliament, and he for the first time spoke about an arc of prosperity that goes all the way from the western shores of the Western Indian Ocean all the way to the outer shores of the Western Pacific. So it's an extremely large arc he was talking about, and he called it the confluence of the two seas. He didn't even call them oceans, because what he was essentially talking about was that to preserve this long arc of prosperity and stability, you need security in the two seas. And the two seas, according to him, was the Andaman Seas and the South China Sea. Because these two seas are on either side of critically the most important choke point in the world, namely the Malacca Straits. On the east, you have the South China Sea. On the west of the Malacca, you have the Andaman Sea. And anybody who controls the Andaman Sea or the South China Sea is obviously going to then have the stranglehold over the Malacca Straits. And because the Malacca Straits is your international choke point for thoroughfare of goods of all kinds from Western Indian Ocean and Indian Ocean all the way into the Pacific, it was important that these two seas maintain their insularity. That means these two seas must be preserved from becoming the province of any one particular power, becoming the hegemonic background or kind of a backyard of any single power. So he talked about it. Admiral Dennis Blair and others of the US Navy, they subsequently began to speak this, but they also never referred to it as the Indo-Pacific. They called it at best the Indo-Asia Pacific, the focus largely being on the Asia Pacific. Because until then, the Americans never really saw any real meaning in getting engaged in the Indian Ocean. Because if you look at Asia's economic, vibrancy, even today you can see that there are two Asias. I mean, there are many other Asias, but there are two big Asias. There is an Asia east of the Malacca, and there is an Asia west of the Malacca. The Asia east of the Malacca is economically dynamic, is prosperous, is rich economies, GDPs are extremely high, their trade integration is very high. Whereas west of the Malacca, if you see largely the Indian Ocean and that part of Asia, which is largely, so you see South Asia, you see Central Asia, you see West Asia, and these are largely places which are poorer. The only thing going for the Western Indian Ocean is, or the Indian Ocean is, that you have the critical resources in the Indian Ocean. Okay, so as a result of this, the conjoining was almost kind of common intuitive logic. Now, as a result of all of this, there was a move towards trying to carve out something like a Indo-Pacific strategy. And 4 countries tried to come together as far back as 2007-8, which are the very 4 countries now who make up the Quad. But why did it fail? And it failed essentially because at that time, Australia was very much in hock with the Chinese. The Australian economy greatly depends on China. Even now, if you see, Australia has entered its worst recession for 30 years. And Scott Morrison remains extremely worried because if the conflict with China continues to escalate, China is in a position to really injure and damage Australia's economic, interests. So what has happened is, China, in fact, was a threat even in 2007. But Australia's closeness with China meant that India, Japan, and the US were not comfortable. Particularly, India was not comfortable in actually being in an alliance, some kind of an alliance, even a strategic alliance, with Australia, wherein there was no trust factor with China. Also at that time, BRICS was being set up. So India also was trying to look at an option where they don't go into direct confrontation with China. And so we were also not totally comfortable with the idea of any kind of a strategic concept of the Quad. Japan also developed its own inhibitions over time because Japan realized that as China was now rebalancing, China needed to be worked with because Japanese economy also depends on China. China and Japan are each other's largest trading partners in many sense of the term, particularly in terms of high value trade. And same applies for the US, which of course has one of its biggest partners after Canada being China. So as a result of that, there was no real mojo to carry forward the Indo-Pacific concept in 2007. Now cut straight to 2017, and that's important. By now, you're seeing a totally different China, because in 10 years, China is no longer the same old economy that produced cheap stuff. If any one of us still, kind of tries to believe that it's the same old China which can be brought down easily, that's not going to happen. It's going to take a strategy to be able to countervail China, and that has to be played in the same game that China is playing with the world. Because China today is an increasingly high value economy. It is beginning to dominate many important critical sectors of the world. And what it has done over the last 10, 12 years in particular, it has built strong areas of interdependence and control over critical sector components. So for example, you look at pharmaceuticals. Unless you get the active pharmaceutical ingredients from China, your drug manufacturing just doesn't happen. So you may be, like for India, for example, we are one of the largest producers of drugs in the world, generic drugs in the world. We are arguably the greatest vaccine producer in the world. But if you don't get your active pharmaceutical ingredients, which come in large quantums from China, you're not going to be able to sustain your industry. Same applies for solar equipment, which comes from China. The components come. Same applies for telecom equipment, where again it comes from China. So what China has done, they have not just gone in on manufacturing. They have identified critical areas so that they can create dependencies in the world on them. So that tomorrow, even if you want to decouple from China, it's not as simple as just decoupling from any other country. In the past, the Soviet Union, you could easily decouple from the Soviet Union because there were other options available. With China, the problem right now is, even when you're going to do Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is a very good step of the Prime Minister, it needed to come at some point in time. It's going to require a very meticulous strategy as to how far to decouple from China and how far to stay engaged with China. Because if you just say, I'm going to shut shop altogether with China, they can tomorrow tell you, I will not supply you, active pharmaceutical ingredients. And what happens then? I will not supply you telecom equipment. What happens then? So you can't totally slap an entire control right away. So in 2017, you had this flurry going on to revive Indo-Pacific. But by now, you had a new president in Washington who obviously was not very keen on the Asia-Pacific. Trump has not been keen on the Asia-Pacific. You've seen how he has dealt with his cornerstone allies. He has dealt with Japan in a very harsh way. He has dealt with South Korea in a very harsh way. He has engaged North Korea without even keeping South Korea in the books at all points in time. So he has also dealt with ASEAN in a very rough way. And he withdrew from a very important trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which in fact killed any kind of economic dynamism in Asia Pacific. To the contrary, he began to understand, for good or bad, that there is a need for a strategy that realigns American understanding of what is really the power balance in this region. And that is where Prime Minister Modi was able to get into his head to make him understand that you need to also focus on the Indian Ocean, because that is where China's power projection is really going to now count. And if we don't stop that power projection of China, or at least raise the cost on that projection, then we are going to face detrimental consequences for decades and for ages. So in 2017, at the Asia Pacific Economic Summit in Hanoi, for the first time, the American president used the term Indo-Pacific. And we live in the age of constructivism when we talk about international theory. where obviously these constructs at the end of the day, what are they? They're ideas. I mean, the Quad. There's nothing like a Quad. I mean, what does a Quad mean? A Quad means 4 countries coming together. But it makes you ideate on what these 4 countries can do together. Because not just any 4 countries. These are 4 important countries in the region. First, 3 of countries are mainstay. That means they're actually situated in this region. These 4 countries are vibrant democracies which can present themselves as exemplars to China. So there is a Chinese way of life and there is a non-Chinese way of life in which these 4 countries can show you what it means to be a good functioning multi-party democracy. You also see the fact that these 4 countries are dynamic economies that spur, free capital, free enterprise, etc., as opposed to the Chinese system. So in a sense, they are presenting a new world order, an alternative world order to what people are today fascinated by is the Chinese world order. So ever since 2017 and the mention of the Indo-Pacific, immediately 2 months later, we had the East Asia Summit, which was being hosted in Philippines. And that is where, for the first time, officials, not ministers, but officials of the Quad met. It was a meeting after 10 long years when they had first tried a meeting. But it was a meeting at the very low level, kind of junior officer level. The reason for that was there was no confidence in whether they can really take this forward. But as you would have seen over the last 3 years now, definitely this has matured. It's matured to some level to the point where today you have foreign ministers who are meeting for the second time. The first meeting happened last September on the sideline of the UNGA, which was hosted by US. But there are still problems in the Quad. And this is where I'm coming to the 3 S's and why I think it's going to be a challenge. Firstly, the Quad, this particular meeting, has to finally nail down on what their common purposes and ideals are. Right now, what the Quad has done, they are defining their common objectives in broad terms. So, for example, they say we are all committed to a rule-based international order. Now, that's like, apple pie. I mean, who will say I am not for a rule-based international order? Any country in the world will say I am for a rule-based international order. And China says we are also for a rule-based international order. But our idea of a rule-based international order is not the American established Western order. So that doesn't solve the problem. That's talking in broad abstractions. That's trying to basically give yourself the space to wriggle out of situations. I think the time has come for the Quad to actually demonstrate solidarity. And why do I say so? China has, over the last 9 months or so, particularly over the last 6 months, really benefited from the fact that the democratic world doesn't speak in world voice in the Indo-Pacific. When China aggressed on Vietnam, the whole world was silent, including ASEAN. There was not a word that came out of ASEAN. Only the American State Department gave a very weak, lukewarm kind of a statement saying we criticize what China has done. China was observing. They then did it to Japan. There was absolutely no mention anywhere about any solidarity with Japan. When it came to Malaysia, yes, there was a certain standoff and, countries stood strong. So China backed off. Subsequently, you see when they did the biggest of audacious steps, which is to engage us in Galwan, in the eastern Ladakh sector, even after we had a hand-to-hand combat in which soldiers were lost for the first time in 40 years, you would have expected the world to at least speak up. But what you found, everybody from Australia to UK making the typical statements which countries always do, which is, we are urging both sides to maintain calm. I mean, when you say both sides to maintain calm, it clearly means that you are just issuing a statement for the heck of it. You are not able to objectively see what is happening, who has transgressed, and asking both sides to get into diplomatic talks. That clearly shows that you are basically equating China, the aggressor, with India, who in this case is the victim. Now, if this is being done by countries in the Indo-Pacific who are considered to be partners, friends of you, of course, I'm accusing India as well. India also didn't do anything when Vietnam was aggressed upon. So I'm saying this tendency where you're leaving each other to fight your own battles is not going to help you deal with the Chinese threat. It is only going to make China's rise more menacing. And China is going to be a dreadful proposition in this region, not because China's power is that great, but when as they say in psephology, when the index of opposition unity is less, even if the main party is disjointed or unorganized, it will still win the election. But if the index of opposition unity is strong, then the single party has to be very careful because anything can happen. So in this case, if they find that the index of opposition unity is low, China is essentially going to drive a wedge through countries and is going to be able to split countries apart. And China has been very good at that. They use various subtle measures and not so subtle measures to break up consensus within organizations. I keep going back to Cambodia because I just can't get over that situation, because 2016, you have this ruling which comes from the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which essentially hands Philippines a victory. It tells China you have no legitimate claims over the maritime island dispute with Philippines. ASEAN says we will meet and we will issue a joint statement. We will take a collective position on this. We are fully in support of Philippines, our fellow member in ASEAN, and we will ask China to take urgent steps to vacate the island. What happened? China was extremely smart. Even before the meeting happened, they reached out to Cambodia, which is considered very much their kind of a lapdog or a kind of a stooge, because they put huge money into Hun Sen's Cambodia. And it's almost like a single family autocratic, kind of leadership that's there. So taking huge money from China. Cambodia is a member within ASEAN, and ASEAN works on the principle of silent consensus, meaning there must be total agreement among the SAARC members among the ASEAN members for ASEAN to issue a statement. What happened here? Cambodia came and said, I don't think this is an important issue. I don't think we need to discuss this matter. This can be dealt with by Philippines and China at the bilateral level. As a result of they saying that, same thing happened with another couple of countries. Laos, PDR also said the same thing. And you had ASEAN consensus that frayed. And China was able to achieve its objective, which is they could not make you issue a joint statement. Now, the problem is, why do I say this? Because the Quad has got into a similar problem. In fact, last year, after the first ministerial meeting of the Quad, India did not even issue a statement. Since 2017, when they've been meeting, it's been very ironical. When 4 people meet in a room, should they be coming out and giving 4 separate individual statements, or should they be giving one common statement that reflects their convergence? It should be one common statement so that the world realizes, the country concerned realizes that the countries are on the same page when it comes to all these issues. The problem is all 4 would go out and give their own versions of what happened in the meeting. And there would always be a disjointedness. So if America uses a term, some kind of a term, India doesn't want to use it. For example, US, Japan, and even to Australia at some extent have been calling for what is called as a free and open Indo-Pacific. That means the Indo-Pacific maritime arteries and waterways must be free and open to all countries and should not be the preserve of any single country. We agree with this, the free and open Indo-Pacific. But in 2018, when Prime Minister Modi addressed the inaugural session of the Shangri-La Dialogue, which was in Singapore, this is the annual security summit, and for the first time an Indian Prime Minister was invited to address the inaugural session, he introduced another word. His official statement that he read out, he said India's policy is for a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. So we are basically saying that we want an FOIIP. Now this word inclusive can mean many things to many countries, because this was seen as India trying to essentially trying to be all things to all people, trying to play clever by half. Because by saying inclusive, no one knows what Prime Minister Modi means. Inclusive means who? So he explained that for India, the Indo-Pacific construct is not an anti-China construct, or it's not an anti-any country concept. It's an inclusive concept where we feel that as much as these waterways belong to us, they also belong to other countries who share these waterways. We were taking a very conciliatory position on China. We were even taking a conciliatory position on Russia. And that's why 3 countries had one point of view, India had a different point of view. India was very concerned on even taking the name of China, because we were not wanting our relations to necessarily get, kind of appended, because Trump wanted us to do that. So we were not on the same page. Today, we are asking for a more tough stand, but maybe other countries are not necessarily wanting that. For example, today we want a very tough stand on China, but Japan is now beginning to have second thoughts, because Japan realizes that now is the era of this, high technology trade. And in high technology trade, Japanese economy and Japanese companies cannot survive if they don't have markets. Now, just look around and see, for high value trade, which is a lucrative market. Is it the Vietnamese market? Is it the New Zealand market? Is it the South Korean market? It's clearly the Chinese market, because China has a big middle class. China has huge companies whom you can partner with. China has huge scale in terms of population and consumption power. So Japanese companies are telling the Japanese leadership that, look, don't get too much sucked into the American game or the Indian game. It is time now for us to also see how we engage with China. So today, India wants a tougher stand. Maybe Japan's walking back a little bit. You see Australia. There was a time Australia was very much in, kind of in tandem with China. Today, it's taken a tough stand. But I'm sure over time, China will, Australia will realize that the economic impact is hurting them badly. And they will also look to, walk back. We still don't know what will happen with a new president. If it's, for example, President Biden, will he take up these cudgels with China in the same way that President Trump has taken? Or will he look for something like an Obama policy, which was tough in some respects, but also doing business with China in other respects? So solidarity is a very, very important concept. We have to look and see what happens with the Quad. The Quad needs to build more convergence, more consensus between themselves. Only then they can draw in other countries. The second is stability. And when I discuss stability, it's important to also say that how do you define stability? One way of defining stability is the conventional notion that we talk in international relations. We say balance of power. So if there is a rising power, if there is a kind of a growing power, then obviously there has to be a constellation of powers who are able to bulwark it, who are able to counter it, who are able to contain it. Now, in today's world of interdependence, how do you decide balance of power? The whole argument of balance of power is very, very complex and complicated. It's not a straightforward game. And why do I say so? In Western concept of the 20th century, power flew from what we have known as the military-industrial complex. So your industrial foundation, your industrial base, blends with your military power and creates this juggernaut called military-industrial complex. This is what gave the US this great dominance for at least half a century. There's a second half of the 20th century. But today, even if you have a modernizing military, and even if you have strong industrial foundations, the future 20, 30, 40 years of the global economy is not going to be only about how strong a military you have or how strong an industry you have in terms of the foundations of it. It is in what way your industry and your military can work with technology to be able to create the new products, the new processes, and the new platforms. So for example, you see China's military modernization. China's military modernization is, if you have to put it in one word, it is technological modernization. Xi Jinping made it very clear that he wants a lean and mean fighting force. He doesn't want to have the world's largest army. He doesn't care. He would rather have the world's largest naval fleet, which of course they have now in 2020. And if anyone has seen the Defense Department report, it is very clear that they are themselves acknowledging that China will be on par in the next 10 to 15 years, which is why the Defense Department now is putting out different plans that they want to roll out. A plan for American defense modernization for 2030, 2045, and beyond. In fact, the Obama time Undersecretary of Defense was just having a meeting yesterday. She's widely expected to probably become the next defense secretary if Joe Biden were to win the election. And she gave a very detailed kind of a speech yesterday when she was talking essentially about what is it that a Biden presidency would do in terms of raising America's defense modernization. And she said, look, it's today no longer about trying to match China platform for platform, because China has reached a stage today where virtually they're putting out a platform, wherein a platform means they're putting out some vessel, some warship, some submarine, or even a robot for that matter, every 6 weeks into the water. So there is something or the other coming into the water every 6 weeks from China. Now, you're not going to be able to keep pace with that because America doesn't have that level of, industrial slickness today. America doesn't have that kind of money today. But what America has, it still has the technological advantages. And what it needs to do is not to go for man to man or platform to platform kind of, sync. It needs to be in a position, as she beautifully put it, we plan to have a strategy for 2030 or 2035, wherein we can send the message to China loud and clear that no matter how big a fleet you have, we can sink all your fleet within 72 hours. If that message goes out to China, that look, no matter how many vessels you may have, you may flood the Pacific Oceans with your vessels, we have the technological means to disable them within 72 hours, we can sink them. Then China will never be in a position to dominate these waters in a predatory way. China will then have to play ball. They will have to play game with the democratic Indo-Pacific. And this is where India, US, kind of defense cooperation is going to be really the headlining element, because this is where we really have to now focus. Some experts in India, well-meaning experts, they have in fact said that this is the right time now for the Indo-Pacific community, whoever wants to join, to come with what is called as an Indo-Pacific Charter. Now, what is this Indo-Pacific Charter? Like you had the Atlantic Charter, which created the UN subsequently. You had the NATO Charter, which was against the Soviet Union. You need an Indo-Pacific Charter, which clearly says these particular steps that China engages in are detrimental to stability in the Indo-Pacific. They will be considered as destabilizing actions. And as a result of that, these countries, the 4 countries at least, plus whoever is willing to join them, we will see to it that these destabilizing actions are counteracted by our own actions. So that is the idea of stability. The third aspect is sustainable development, what we call as sustainability. At the end of the day, you cannot base any credible strategy of managing China's rise by simply trying to bring China down. Because when you spend too much time on trying to bring somebody down, you actually don't bring that person down. You actually bring your person down to that person's level. They always say, don't try and rub the line of your opponent. Draw a bigger line in the sand than your opponent. There are 2 ways of looking at it. So if we just keep thinking, how can we bring China down? That's not going to happen. China has an organic rise which is built into it. It is going to rise. It is going to be a kind of a big power. The question is, how do we create the necessary, kind of conditions whereby, one, we raise the cost on China. China feels that, okay, if I take this particular action, the incentives are not worth it. It's not worth doing it. So let me not do it. Now, how do you do that? You don't do that by simply, kind of whining at China. And what has happened for a long time with the world is, particularly with the Americans, they have only kept grumbling and bemoaning about China's rise. Well, if the Americans had the right to rise, why don't the Chinese have the right to rise? Why doesn't India have the right to rise? Every legitimate country has the right to rise. If it has the capability, it will rise. India also has the capability, it will rise. Nobody can stop India's rise. Yes, it may take longer, but India is organically quite clear that based on its demography, based on its geography, its size, India is bound to be a major power in the next 15-20 years. But the point is, we need to come with alternative vision of how we plan this Indo-Pacific. And that is why I believe that there are various different propositions which need to really be taken forward. Now, which are those? And I'll just quickly kind of go through them in the next 3-4 minutes. First is the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. This has huge implications because this was drafted in 2016. It was announced in 2017. This is a collaborative concept of India and Japan. Now, why India and Japan? Because India brings acceptability to any project in the Indian Ocean. If India is part of it, there are rarely any countries who say we don't want to be part of it, because India is seen as a team player. Okay, you will have countries who will say, if China is part of it, we would like to stay out. But that doesn't happen with India, because India is not seen as a threat by anybody. So for Japan and its financing and its capability to build high quality infrastructure, they have a notion called Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. India becomes the right kind of gel, because India brings in the scale, also brings in the legitimacy and the acceptability. But you see, 3 years into this plan, and I was the other day having a conversation with Japanese think tanks, I said, look, please tell me if you have any data and you can actually correct me. But I do believe that the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, in 3 years of articulation, has not moved beyond paper. It has remained on paper. Now, this is not done. So they agreed that yes, right now, and they agreed that only about 8 or 9 projects have really been identified, but we are nowhere close to even starting those projects, leave alone completing those projects. Now, when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, China, for good or bad, continues to build projects, and on the other hand, you only have a talking club. You only have a discourse club, that keeps giving these normative ideas of rules-based international order and free global commons. The countries are going to say, give me an option, give me an alternative. Yes, that is where now there is some movement happening. So, for example, you see recently, the Indian government has become very proactive. They have now issued the first real big infrastructure project in the region, and that is in Maldives. We have this Greater Malay Connectivity Project, connecting the capital of Malay with their islands through bridges in the ocean. Now that's fantastic. I hope this actually can be done because we have put $500 million actually up front. So we're not just talking, we are looking to walk the talk. And I'm sure that with the support of Japan, United States, countries, like-minded countries, South Korea, France, Germany, which also want to be part of the Indo-Pacific, as a consortium, we can get this completed. It's not impossible. Now, when you build something like a Greater Malay Connectivity Project, then Maldivians understand that, look, what were the Chinese doing to us? The Chinese came here promising that we will connect your islands and we will make you a tourism hub. But at the end of it, what did they do? They sunk Maldives in anywhere between, well, the figures vary, but anywhere between $6 to $8 billion, which is huge for the Maldivian economy. They cannot really pay back. But India is not putting them into that kind of debt. We are making it very clear, if you want the project, we will be part of it. You decide if you want the project or not. So you can only show an alternative when you're actually willing to promise something which is tangible, not just deal in normative contestation. The second aspect is what right now is being talked about. Again, it's an India-led initiative. It basically flows from, I'm sure all of you know, this International Solar Alliance, which we've had now for the last 3 years. And this has been a masterstroke of Prime Minister Modi in 2015, but carried forward with the support of France and doing excellently well. We have 120 countries who have signed on to it. More than 80 countries have ratified it. You have Latin American countries, African countries. Basically, it is about trying to create greater and greater solar energy capacity and usage across lesser developed countries so that their renewable energy targets can be met. Now, you know that when you look at sustainable development goals of the UN, one of the most critical goals is always about, renewable energy, because that is what is all about now. Energy usage per unit per capita. And countries which are lesser developed are using more of fossil fuels, which is not only bad for the environment, but it's also not cost effective when the economy turns around. So you need more other sources. Now, why India? That day a question was asked to me, but why India? And is India serious? And I said, yes, India is serious. Because you know that we have recently in Rewa, Madhya Pradesh, Prime Minister Modi inaugurated the largest solar power plant anywhere in Asia. We also have a lot of usage of solar in India that is now increasing. In fact, Gujarat, the state from which he came from, has been a leader in the solar energy sector. And we have teamed up with France, which is a European pioneer when it comes into for solar energy. We also have now the involvement of Germany. And Germany for a long time was the largest manufacturer of solar panels and solar power equipment. So there are a lot of countries in the world. Japan is also interested in this, in looking at this project and taking it forward. But simply talking of the International Solar Alliance is fine. But what is that big project? So in 2020, this year, we have launched a project and we have put about, I think, $625 million from the SBI has already been put towards it as a corpus. What we are calling as the one world, the one sun, one world, one grid concept, which is essentially try and build an entire interconnection of grids, solar grids all over the global south. That is Latin America, Africa, Asia. The whole idea is not to do it in the advanced countries because they don't need it, to do it across the length and breadth of the lesser advanced countries. And they're going to start in 3 phases. So the first phase will look at lesser developed countries to India's east, that is in South Asia, and Southeast Asia, the poorer countries of Southeast Asia, namely Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, etc. The second phase is going to be looking more at Africa. And third phase will look at Latin America. Now, of course, there's a big question mark because it has been launched now. The pandemic has struck. There's no money going around. How are you going to do it is going to be a big question mark. But if this, and again, there are many countries willing to join with this. So India right now is in the mode of talking to many countries. In fact, this could become a flagship of the International Solar Alliance. And President Macron, Chancellor Merkel have actually been favorable on this. So if this can be done even to the extent of 30%, 40%, 50% successful, it will be a potential competitor to China's debt-laden program, which basically blackmails countries into dependence. But what will happen? You will be able to provide a very viable and credible alternative of sustainability than simply trying to sustain your argument through normativity. I think I'll stop here, and I think let's spend some time on taking some questions. So thank you very much.
Adrita, can you please take up the questions?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I'll just look into the question. Um, First question is very long actually. I'll just try to read out the short ones. Do you see a potential Russo-Sino war possible in context of the Vladivostok, uh, Vladivostok East China Sea conflict? Thoughts on over subscription of Japanese subsidy to shift production from China?
Okay. Now look, there are these two questions. Look, when the Japanese decided to take this action of putting out $2.2 billion out there to relocate their companies out of China, everyone saw it as basically a kind of a knee-jerk panic reaction. Of course, they have done that. But what you have seen is Japanese companies have been less than enthusiastic. So, for example, even though the Japanese government told them initially that you can move back and we'll subsidize your program, not many companies were really willing to move. And that was the fact, which is why now Japan has tried to modulate that and said that even if you don't want to move back to Japan, if you want to move to Bangladesh, if you want to move to India, that relocation is also eligible. It makes you eligible for the relocation cost of shipment out. Now, the point is, and this is the point I was trying to make, that even post-pandemic, as the Indo-Pacific community talks about things like supply chain resilience initiative, trying to move supply chains away from China, trying to build alternative trajectories of supply chains, this is easier said than done. It's very easy to make these tall claims. It will take a long time to really bring it into effect, because even now what we are seeing amongst the companies that are doing this or looking to do this, they're not really moving lock, stock, and barrel out of China. There is no company that's looking to say, I want to wind up and shut shop in China altogether. In fact, what they're saying is we are looking at only relocating superfluous plants. So for example, if I have 6 or 7 plants in China, it's not a good strategy to have all of them in China, because if China gets disrupted again or disrupts itself again, either of the two, we could suffer. So you move out 1 or 2 of your plants out. So that, for now, that remains a strategy. So the ability of the non-Chinese world in the Indo-Pacific, if I put it that way, to be able to really gravitate these projects towards them is a huge question mark. Now, coming back to this whole issue of Vladivostok situation, I was yesterday having a seminar with Russian experts, and it was very interesting that they also seem to believe that bringing in the far east of Russia into the Indo-Pacific discussion may actually be very important. Why? First of all, Russia today is having to play second fiddle to China. It's having to do that because since 2014, the Crimea, invasion, Russia has come under deep sanctions. And those sanctions possibly may only get deepened if the Alexei Navalny poisoning issue that has happened, if that is taken up in a very serious way by Europe, then there could be more NATO sanctions on Russia. So Russia is being cornered by the West. Russia recognizes this, but Russia has few options. This suits China because this has put Russia into a kind of a supplicant role with China. China in return has promised a lot of things, plenty of goodies to Russia. One of them, they promised was to develop Russia's Far East in terms of infrastructure. Initially, Putin was very excited with the offer because who would not be excited? The Chinese have built so many smart cities. The Chinese actually have done things on the ground. So when they tell you, look, we'll come and build this for you, you sometimes get very excited. But over time, President Putin has seen how the whole narrative is playing out. He has seen the pushback that is happening across the Indo-Pacific, and he doesn't want to be totally dependent on China with regard to the Far East. And that is why last year when Prime Minister Modi was invited, in fact, that also was a very interesting message, because honestly, we have been buying oil from the Sakhalin Islands. We have been doing things out from there on the Russian Far East for a long time. But we have had stakes there. But it's not as though we were really interested in the Russian Far East. Now, as a result of Prime Minister Modi being invited to the Economic Forum last year, and when he spoke there, subsequently you saw that we signed this very important energy corridor agreement, which is the Chennai Vladivostok energy corridor. This has now become a potential for India and Russia to look to build an alternative alignment. What does it do? First of all, it brings India straight into the Far East economic situation. India is saying we would like to team up with Japan. We would like to team up with other countries and build infrastructure in that part of Russia. This could also help the whole trilateral between India, Russia, and Japan to formalize. Because right now, if you have heard what Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide said, he had a phone call with Putin about 3 days ago, in which they discussed that they would like to go back and find an early resolution to the Kuril Islands dispute. These are the islands that are basically disputed between Russia and Japan. And they go back to World War II and before that. Now, Japan does realize, and so does Russia, that if they can get some degree of agreement on how they at least develop these islands, this means that it builds a counterbalance to China. So Putin says to China, look, come in, you build, I'm happy with you. But he also tells them, look, you are not the only game in town. You are not the only player in town. There are other players also. So if I'm not happy with your offer, I could get a counter offer from them as well. So he is looking at diversifying his options in the Russian Far East. India looks at the opportunity to get closer to Russia. In the words of Dr. Jayakar, who recently in one of his interviews said, quote unquote, he was asked, what is the one way to make China understand the importance of India? He said, why China and India? Any country. If you want to be really seen as important, you have to get into the mind space of that country, mind space. Like you see, China has got into the mind space of India. For good or bad, we constantly keep talking about China as though we are obsessed with China. We have to also create that same situation where the Chinese leadership, if not Chinese people, the Chinese leadership has to see India around it. So it has to recognize that just as they are trying to ring fence India in the Indian Ocean, that India also is looking at options to be able to at least be around them and to be able to influence the situations out there. Thank you.
Of the participants wants to ask me questions directly, so I would request them to ask.
Hi, may I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, do you think a dual hegemonic system is possible vis-a-vis having two large regional hegemons but no singular global hegemon? So, do you think the rise of China is an existential threat to America's dominance and I would say also to American sovereignty?
Okay. Look, traditionally we have always believed that the presence of two hegemons actually bring balance of power, because that's what the Cold War was all about. And many people said that, look, there was stability in the world because you had two superpowers as opposed to a single superpower. We then saw a period of about 20 years, 25 years, let's say, where we have seen the undisputed unipolar emergence and presence of the US. That had large degree of stability as well, but also brought certain degrees of instability. We now, when we look to the world, there's some who say we are again, kind of drifting back into bipolarity. But I would still say that I don't think that age of bipolarity, which we saw in the past, is going to come back again. I think what you said was interesting. There will not be a global hegemon. Even China will not be able to become the global hegemon, because there are a few factors here. When you want to become a hegemon, you also need to have to ability for international leadership. China so far, and I don't even see that in the future, that China really has it in it to be able to demonstrate international leadership. International leadership is not going and intimidating countries or browbeating countries or, slimily and slyly taking countries' territories away. That's not leadership. That is intimidation. That is power which is being used with brute force. But international leadership is being able to build a world order where you are acknowledged as the leader. And that's what the US could do for a long time, good or bad. We may have disagreements with the US on many issues, but the liberal international order that we all subscribe to, broadly speaking, is the US built post-Second World War order. Can the Chinese build that kind of order in the 21st century? Looks very unlikely, because the Chinese have this habit where they are not necessarily wanting to get involved in global affairs. They want to do things on the cheap. So, for example, you don't expect Chinese Navy or Chinese military to be positioned globally like how the American military has now been positioned. America is a true global power because America has got its Navy, its military position all around the world. Those kind of theaters the Chinese are not interested in. The Chinese are still very much a constabulary nation. That means they look very much at what are their crucial theaters. You may say, but sir, what about Belt and Road Initiative? And I would come back and say the same thing. They seem to be picking off and cherry picking projects one by one without necessarily saying we want to be a global hegemon. They are not tomorrow going to go into Senegal or some, Burkina Faso or some country of Africa because there is a problem there. You look at the Chinese in the UN Security Council. They rarely speak on any issue unless it concerns them. It's only when it concerns them, they come in very strongly and they're even willing to veto. Otherwise, what happens in the world, they could hardly care. But the United States, whether for right or for wrong, would get itself involved in every issue in the world because it saw itself as that kind of a global leader. So I think in the current context, China becomes an existential threat, not because it will become a global hegemon, but it is developing specific critical hegemonic power in strategic domains. That makes it an existential threat. For example, if you had to look at what makes it an existential threat in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think just the presence of Chinese Navy makes it a threat. Because remember, patrolling the Indian Ocean is not a joke. We all know how expansive the Indian Ocean is, right? Even the Americans in their prime could never have imagined to patrol the Indian Ocean all by themselves. So to think that the Chinese will do it for the next 30, 40 years won't happen. Chinese are not looking at that. They're not looking at just putting their Navy all across the Indian Ocean. They are looking for strategic capabilities in the Indian Ocean. While we are all the time obsessed with seeing a Chinese warship, the Indian Navy will tell you that at any point in time around India's EEZ, particularly on the western side, on the western coast, there are about 6 to 8 Chinese submarines and warships that continue to lurk. Now, somebody will say 6 or 8 is not a big figure. Yeah, but I'm saying at any point in time, they keep, rotating between themselves. We have seen over the last 2 years, and this is something that doesn't get spoken about much, underwater domain awareness. The Chinese ability to control the underwater domain awareness is becoming extremely strong. And this is an area we all seem to ignore because we like to see China on the surface. But China is doing a lot of work below the surface in the subcutaneous waters. For the last 2 years, the 18 and 19 I'm talking about, at least 26 different Chinese surveillance ships have made, and vessels have made their presence in the Indian Ocean, particularly near the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea. Of course, keeping out of India's EEZ. And why have they come here? Why 26 ships have come? They obviously have not come on a picnic. They have come with underwater submersibles. These are surveillance ships which basically do geospatial and ocean floor mapping. They essentially are doing an total geospatial mapping of the ocean floor so that they can actually determine what are the rare earths available in which parts of the Indian Ocean, which they can then go and seize so that they can control the rare earth market. Which is why one of the things that we are all looking at in the meeting on the 6th when the Quad meets is, can the Quad agree that the India-US COMCASA agreement, we signed this COMCASA agreement 2 years ago, which is Communication Security and Compatibility Act. Basically an agreement whereby US will share encrypted data on geospatial ocean floor mapping with India in real time. And we can do synchronized activity with tracking Chinese surveillance vessels in our region. If these 4 countries can announce that or something like that, that look, COMCASA is now going to become a quad-wide agreement. So all 4 countries, Japan, US, Australia, and India, will share data across their exclusive economic zones. So any Chinese vessel coming in and trying to act smart can be, liable for disruption. If that happens, that makes the Chinese existential threat much lesser. So you understand? So 1, they don't have the leadership to be able to be a global hegemon. 2, the world is not of the kind where you can have a single or maybe 2 hegemons. But 3, also the very fact that if we can build critical counter abilities, we can actually prevent them from becoming an existential threat. Thank you.
Right.
May I ask one question? Hello.
So may I ask
Yes.
you a question?
Yes.
Yes, sir. My question is with regard to the RIC and the Quad. Do you think RIC has also, that also have to be taken care when we go with Quad?
Okay. Again, a very interesting question, because look, India is in a very difficult neighborhood. And for one, we have to always keep in mind that what works for the US or what works for Japan, what works for Australia, may not work for us. So every country has its own, peculiarities that they have to look at. What Prime Minister Modi tried to do for the first 5.5, 6 years of his government was to try and find some kind of a balance between the RIC and the JAI. That means Japan, America, India trilateral and the Russia, India, China trilateral. Now, if you see both these trilaterals, the one common letter is I, which is India. And in a sense, both of these formations have been looking at India as being a critical component. Now, where India carries weight within the larger Asian context, because India is a swing state. India is to be always called a swing state. So whichever side India oscillates to, that side would be seen as having some degree of an advantage because of India's location, because of India's democracy, India's economy, etc., etc. But the world is now not so easily finessed, because I would take you back 22 years when for the first time the RIC was, in a sense, proposed. It was done by Russian Prime Minister, then Russian Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, who came to meet Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and he told Prime Minister Vajpayee that we would like to form the RIC. At that time, he was told you can go ahead and look to form it, but the problem is we don't anticipate any real merit or proactive cooperation in the RIC, because we have a huge issue of trust with China. We don't have a trust issue with you, but we have an issue with China, and validly so. Over time, if you see, the RIC was not very active. Right through the time of Dr. Manmohan Singh's 10 years, you never really saw RIC meetings happening. In fact, the BRICS took over. So you had an RIC within BRICS anyway, but you never saw meetings of RIC happening. It was always kept on the sidelines. It seemed to have been ignited after Prime Minister Modi took over. And that is because of the kind of bonhomous engagement that he tried to build with China over the first 5 years. In the current context, there is very little that the RIC can do in the current context until there is diffusion of tension between India and China. But long term, there is still scope and prospect for the RIC to be a potential balancer to any kind of Chinese perception that the Indo-Pacific is anti-China. Because although the Chinese are convinced on this issue, I think our actions would need to show in the future. I'm not saying right now. Right now, we have to play the pressure of the Quad and the pressure of the Indo-Pacific to try and neutralize China in the interim, to get them to vacate parts of Ladakh, which they have taken. But once things settle down and we go back to engaging with China, we may not be in a position to take up a very strident position in the Quad, which is very anti-China, because we can be hurt in many different ways, most notably in South Asia. We have a huge problem in South Asia, and I'm not talking only in terms of SARC, because SARC looks like it's dead, but in terms of the geostrategic South Asia. Today, we are looking to push BIMSTEC, and we are looking to see how we can, make BIMSTEC the critical vehicle, which is the Bay of Bengal, economic grouping, which keeps Pakistan out effectively. But the point is, even in BIMSTEC now, the Chinese pressure on BIMSTEC is growing extremely high. We have a huge problem of China's increasing role in Afghanistan, which makes us very worried. Because with Taliban being very, very cozy with the Chinese, if the if the Doha round of talks is going to lead to ultimately the Taliban joining the Afghan government, you could actually see China making a big push, economic push for resources in Afghanistan, in tandem with Pakistan. What does that do then to our West Asia strategy? We have China's role increasing in Iran, and the Americans kept us under tremendous pressure, which is why we really had to burn our bridges with Iran. As a result of which today we are essentially having to keep in some possible way Chabahar salvaged so that we don't lose Chabahar. So there are tremendous pressures on us, and we must also remember, if we become decidedly anti-China for reasons of compulsion, not so much choice, but compulsion, Russia will drift away from you. This is very clear. This has been made plain even by Moscow. And right now we have to finesse it, because we can't still accept the fact that we can actually walk away from Russia altogether and build our defense relationship only with the US. We will have to walk this tightrope at least for the next, let's say, a decade or so, before we have reached a stage where we can then call the shots and say, now is the time to decide which way we want to go in terms of our defense production. So for now, we need to be with the Russians, which means we have to ensure that we don't burn our bridges with Russia and China. And that's why in the long term, RIC and J may have to continue. But in terms of actual accomplishment, obviously the Quad will have to deliver more, because the Quad is part of existential interest for India. The RIC is more basically to kind of act as a stabilizing balancer and to keep threats away from us. So it's more like a defensive posture in the RIC. It's more like an assertive posture in the Quad. Thank you.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
May I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
So, sir, I have a couple of questions to ask. Firstly, sir, recently the Kra Canal, which is in Thailand, it is in news. It has often been said as an alternative to the Malacca Strait. Uh, how do you see its commencement being a shift in change of power, in the Indian Ocean? Then, secondly, sir, as you talked about Russia, don't you think Russia nowadays has become an ineffective power? As recently in the issue of Armenia and Azerbaijan, didn't just follow its obligation, which was conferred under the treaty with Armenia of providing the military military defense. And don't you think, sir, our foreign policy is now becoming more baffling with the commencement of Quad? As sir, we are part of SU and BRICS, and we have very difficult choice to make.
Okay, so you asked about 2 or 3 questions. So let me go with the first one first. There's no doubt that the Kra Canal has been proposed now for a long time by China as a kind of a circumvention of the Malaccan dilemma. But it was easier said than done, because even though it was a very audacious thing of splitting up Thailand essentially into 2 by creating a kind of a canal across it, it was never going to really succeed so easily, because the costs were extremely high. It was going to pull Thailand out of its kind of balance that it had in its foreign policy, and make it almost a kind of a Chinese agent, almost like a Pakistan to China when it comes to the east of the Indian Ocean. Thirdly, the current government of Prayut Chan-o-cha, which is the military government, now a democratic government, has tried to very consciously build relations with the US as well as a counterbalance, because Thailand for a long time has kept a military alliance with the US going. So that had been its biggest indemnifier or biggest insurance against being totally dependent on China. I think the signs are promising now, because we have seen in the last few months that due to these huge protests, the Kra Canal essentially has been deferred. It hasn't been scrapped totally, because there's a lot of mixed messaging on what exactly has happened. But it doesn't look like it's been scrapped, but definitely it's been deferred. Now, that is also going to have its own implications, because ASEAN comes into the picture. And Singapore has just made a statement a couple of days ago, where they once again repeated to both China and the US that, look, don't force us to take sides, because it is not in our keeping to actually choose sides between the US and China. So in that sense, ASEAN countries actually do not want to be able to have to choose sides. So Thailand also being part of ASEAN is obviously not wanting to choose sides and actually is choosing the safer option of basically keeping the canal out. Because once the canal is created, it's going to create its own dynamics in terms of how things operate. Now, secondly, about Russia, look, how do you actually come to terms with what kind of a power a country is? When we say that, look, it's not an effective power or it's an ineffectual power. I think Russia, obviously, in the current situation, has really become a kind of a strategic disruptor. Russia is no longer the superpower it used to be. It's no longer the arbiter of any conflict. That's true. On its own, it doesn't really arbiter any conflict, but it still carries the potential to be a spoiler, a strategic disruptor. And it's done that in many parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. Cast your mind back. What saved Bashar al-Assad? His regime. His regime would have been gone if not for the threat given by President Putin to President Obama at the St. Petersburg G20 that, look, if you step in and try and do regime change in Syria, like your previous president did with Saddam Hussein, or you did with Muammar Gaddafi, you will have to face Russia first and Syria later. And America backed off, as a result of which the red line never got crossed, which Obama laid down, and Bashar al-Assad lived to fight another day. Similarly, we have seen in many parts, including North Korea. North Korea has been assisted not only by China, but also by Russia in terms of putting America on the back foot. Now, the problem is within the Caucasus and within the larger borderlands of Russia, it's an extremely tricky situation. Because one thing, Russia does not want to necessarily conflagrate the situation. Because what is on Russia's mind, if it steps into the war, of course, it has treaty obligations, but the point remains there are various kinds of obligations of various kinds. For example, Lukashenko of Belarus. Now, if you look at the loose federation that Belarus and Russia have, Russia should be coming to the assistance of Belarus. But Russia has told Belarus, you ask us for troops, then we will deploy them. Because Russia does not want to give any excuse to NATO or to the United Nations to deploy their peacekeepers or to deploy their armory on Russia's borderlands. And Russia believes that these wars are in a sense stoked so that they can provide an excuse for NATO or an excuse for the UN to try and step in some form or the other to establish themselves on the doorstep with Russia. So Russia tends to be extremely careful in picking off countries that they want to, which is why when they picked off Ukraine essentially when Ukraine was deeply destabilized in 2014. They first worked on Ukraine for a long time in destabilizing them, then went in and in a swoop, they took Crimea and they held a referendum subsequently. Similarly, if you see what they have done across many parts, the same they did to Georgia in 2008. They allowed Georgia a very long rope. The new leader of Georgia, who was very anti-Russian, the moment they perceived that Georgia was now on the verge of signing their commitment to NATO, which would make Georgia essentially a NATO ally and a kind of a NATO member, and would put troops in Georgia, they went and smashed the hell out of Georgia. So I won't say Russia is an ineffectual power. Russia is no longer a global power, but Russia is still a strategic disruptor. It's a destabilizing power. And don't forget, powers are not only determined by the military capacity, particularly today, they are also determined by your sabotage capacity, by your subterfuge capacity, by your subversion capability. And we all know what Russia has been up to. I mean, we've seen that happening in various parts of the world. Just cast your mind to Europe and just see how Russia has used its political capital to destabilize many countries in Europe, at least the political scene in many countries in Europe. Today, you see Viktor Orban in Hungary. You see the Chancellor in Austria. You see the Alternative for Democracy Party rising in Germany. You see Marine Le Pen, who's getting stronger. Of course, she was always there, but she's getting stronger with support of Russia, including the UK Independence Party in England. So Russia has been funding many political parties to destabilize governments in Europe, to make pro-Russian governments come to power. So I would say before we make a judgment on what is an effective power or an ineffectual power, we must look at new notions of power. There is hard power, there's soft power, but the more important thing, we have gone much beyond it. We are now into the world of smart power and in fact sharp power. So it's on the context of sharp power with hard power, that's where Russia still calls the shots. And let's also remember one more thing. we should still not discount Russia, because even though their defense sector has come under very difficult situations because of the economic situation, they don't have the right kind of technological support at all times, which is shown in their navy. Still, they have cutting edge weaponry, which is extremely important. And we've seen with the S-400, right? We are not the only country who bought the S-400. In fact, the Americans, when they tried to, counsel us, they still counsel us saying you should not buy the S-400. We told them very politely, why don't you tell this to Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia is your ally. Why did they go and look for the S-400? Why has Egypt looked for the S-400? Egypt is your ally. I mean, I can understand Turkey. I will not talk Turkey because right now under Erdogan, Turkey is not really an ally of the US. But even Turkey, the biggest worry for America is if Turkey actually gets the S-400, America cannot continue NATO defense cooperation with Turkey anymore, because that will mean that Turkey will be compromising, the security intelligence with the Russians. So the Russians still have capacity to influence conditions. They may not always be able to do it on their own, but I would not necessarily say that they have lost their kind of mojo so soon. Thank you.
Sir, I have one more point to add up. As you talked
Yeah.
of North Korea and Russia's role in North Korea, recently India was also seen as reaching towards North Korea and making strategic advancement there. How do you see this move in the context of Indo-Pacific?
Yeah. Now look, directly the India-North Korea relationship is not really going to affect the Indo-Pacific, because North Korea remains a reclusive authoritarian state. But our policy for a long time, and I must here do say that I must go back a long time across governments, we've held a particular point of view that we don't want to necessarily outcast or ostracize North Korea, which is why we are only one of 25, 26 countries which actually has an ambassador in North Korea. Recently also, in fact, VK Singh last to last year, he actually met with the North Korean leadership twice. So we keep all engagements open. In fact, their foreign minister did make a visit during Prime Minister Modi's first term, when of course Prime Minister Modi refused to meet him. I mean, in the sense he avoided meeting him, but there was a meeting obviously with VK Singh and of course with Sushma Swaraj as well. Now the point is, we do look at North Korea, one, because North Korea has tremendous mineral resources. I mean, if you look at North Korea, we don't realize this, but they are abundantly rich with all kinds of strategic natural resources, including rare earth minerals. And nobody is more interested in those resources than South Korea. In fact, the reason Moon Jae-in is trying his level best to convince Kim Jong-un that, look, give up this posture and of, being a communist kind of an idea, kind of an authoritarian state, a military state, and actually become part of the global community, because you have the potential to shape the North Korea of the future. Your country can be an extremely rich country and a very prosperous country. But obviously his room for maneuver is little, because he can't do much without the concurrence of China, which basically holds the aces on him. Now, India's role with North Korea is basically for 2-3 reasons. One, North Korea is a major serial proliferator of ballistic missile weapons. In fact, most of the ships that have been interdicted over the last, let's say, 20, 25 years over time, invariably you've had the flag of North Korea, or even if you had the flag, let's say, of Panama or some other country, you had North Korean crew on board, and you've invariably found North Korean missiles with markings. Okay, so they have been a serial ballistic missile proliferator. That's their weight, that's their revenue stream. So we obviously want to keep them engaged so that they don't take an adversarial position against us. Because remember, sometime back when the AQ Khan network was very, very active in the context of Pakistan's nuclear program, it was basically seen that it was Libya, North Korea, and Pakistan nuclear proliferation network that was at work. So we don't want that situation where now you have a big front against us, where you have North Korea and then you have China, which is against us right now, and Pakistan, because North Korea can be a very dangerous state because it likes to have these kind of dangerous weapons up its sleeve. And the latest one that worries us is obviously is biological weapons. Because I'm sure after what's happened with the pandemic, there are many authoritarian leaders around the world who are actually exploring this kind of a medium, because it's much cost effective in the long run, and it's easier to deploy against a state as opposed to nuclear weapons, which can be knocked out with a strike, with a preemptive strike. Second is, we over the years have been giving a lot of North Korean students, a fair number, I would say by North Korea standards, scholarships under our ITech program, which is our technical education program. This goes back to the time when, communist states, and we were doing that together. So they were also a communist state under the grandfather Kim Il-sung and then the father Kim Jong-il, etc., etc. So there are even now, what we understand, even as the pandemic has struck, something like 50 or 55 North Korean students who actually are believed to be in India in different parts of India. And the funny thing is, recently, sometime back, the government said that we don't have an accurate number on exactly how many and where are they. Now, that's not a good sign, because North Korea is not only known as a serial violator in terms of ballistic missile program, it's a huge exponent when it comes to disruption through sabotage of cyber security. And in fact, if you see most of the malware worms that have been found in Singapore and other places, including sometime back, I think 2-3 years ago, when there was a malware attack on Singapore's health records, and all the records of Singapore's citizens, including that of the Prime Minister, were compromised. When they went back to try and see where the malware had come from, the server was essentially showing that it came from somewhere in North Korea. So North Korea does have this kind of sabotage, kind of surveillance capabilities. We would not like them to necessarily become part of a larger front, without reason, where unnecessarily we give them reason to consider India as an enemy. Also, what we have done, we have shown them that, look, we are compassionate, because even last year and even this year, in the wake of the pandemic, we have given them food aid. We have actually given money to the World Food Program to be able to supply food to North Korea. So we've told North Korea that, look, we are interested in your, and by the way, we also import $140 million of coal imports, which is a large number, which we don't normally realize. But we had been doing this till about last year. I'm not sure of this year, but till about last year, we were importing coal to the extent we're allowed within the sanctions regime. So because of all this, it is more like a kind of a defensive posture. It is to see that you do basically, enemy denial through softer measures of Indian diplomacy. Thank you.
So much, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Sorry, everybody, we cannot take any more questions right now. So I would like to thank you, sir, for giving us time, his valuable time in answering all our questions. Thank you, Think India organization, for organizing such a informative session. Thanks to participants for actively participating in this. And I would like to request every participants who are not in our forum, I would request them to join our forum, international forum. And to join that, I would request them to mail at irforum.thinkindia.org@gmail.com. If I'm not wrong, I will just post it in the chat box.
Sure. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I look forward to remaining associated with Think India. Thank you.
Much, sir. One more thing, that we are also looking forward to make this IR forum, transform it into a form of research team, and we will be more than happy to have you on our editorial board as well.
Sure.
Thank
always
you.
welcome. Yeah, always welcome.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank
Such
you.
an
Thank you so
insight.
much. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Yeah. Thank you.
Same to you.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm ending the session.